It is wonderful to get your first son, to establish a family, to make a happy home. But the first home of humans ended in tragedy. Welcome to another tidbit from the Bible. We're studying Genesis. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and we have arrived to the story of Cain and his aftermath. The texts are from Genesis 4 until the beginning of chapter 6. And this is the context. The first human couple, Adam and Eve, have been dispelled from their original perfect home. And now Eve gets a son. The son is a hope for new life, and this is what he calls him, according to a New International Version: with the help of the Lord I have brought forth a man. Now, the translation with the help of the Lord is traditionally, in reality, I have got a son, the Lord. There is an object marker, and it may be, she's thinking, is this the Savior? It wasn't. Not only one son she gets one more. That is a wonderful family, and probably a lot more too. But as they grow up, it becomes anarchy. This is the story of humankind. And Cain and Abel, the first two human beings, they bring God an offering. And as we read later in the Bible, for instance in Hebrews 11:4, there is a difference between the two. Cain brings an offer of his own production, the produce of the land that he is cultivating. Abel brings, according to the established law for sacrifices, a sacrifice pointing to the future sacrifice that God will make. So he is bringing a sacrifice in faith. Cain is bringing a sacrifice as an achievement. So God looks with favor on the sacrifice of Abel, and Cain gets angry and jealous. God offers him forgiveness if he will follow the law, but he turns to Abel, and when he finds the opportunity, he kills him. So much for the happy home. This is the first murder, and that is how it has been ever since. Now, as the account moves on, you move in two lines. You have the line of Cain, and you have the line of the other son that is born, replacing Abel. The birth of Seth, the third son, is described in verses 25 and 26 in chapter 4. Adam lay with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth, saying, God has granted me another child, another offspring, descendant, seed, the same word as in Genesis 3:15, in place of Abel. At that time, it is said, men began to call the name of the Lord, implying that the generation that followed Seth was a generation that kept the worship of God alive. They worshipped God. But let's move back to the brief but very significant description of Cain's descendants. Cain fled the Lord far away from the Garden of Eden, and then it is said in verse 17 in chapter 4, Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant, gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. So the first activity of Cain is the beginning of an empire building. Now remember, the creation account is told in such a way that you see God is building his house, his temple. Now Cain is building his. Is it good to build a city? Now that depends on whether you like to live in the countryside or in the city. But in the Bible here, this is the beginning of an empire building. Is it good or evil? That we see a little later. Now, somebody noticed, well, Enoch, isn't that the one who is walking with God? No, that's another Enoch. Because in the two list of generations, the generation of Cain and the generation of Seth, Adam, in the following chapter, in chapter 5, you have both an Enoch and a Lamech. And Enoch, the descendant of Cain, is building a city. Enoch, the descendant of Seth, is walking with God and home with God. Now, what about Lamech? Well, the first Lamech, in the offspring of Cain, marries first two women. That is never good. Next, he says to his wife, according to verse 23 and 24, Ada and Silla, listen to me, wives of Lamech. Lamech or Lamech, that's the same. Hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding, a young man for enduring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. So, the characteristic of Lamech or Lamech is the will to power, not ethics. So you have in the offspring of Cain, you have an empire builder, and you have the will to power. And what about Lamech in the generation following Seth? It is said in chapter 5 that he was the father of Noah. He named his son Noah and said in verse 28, he will comfort us in a labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. He was still worshipping God. So here you have the opposite, the two lines, fighting from the beginning, fighting with might and power and empire building, and then those who are worshipping God. And then the two begin to mix and disaster arrives. In chapter 6, you have the often misunderstood and abused account when men began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them that they chose. There are several interpretations of this story. One is a mythological one, looking to stories about divine beings who have visited mankind, as you find them in the mythologies of many ancient people. They say, oh, these are heavenly beings who come down and have sexual intercourse with humans because they like them, and that's it. But that is not what is in mind here. Notice, correctly translated by NIV, they married them. This is not speaking about short incidental sexual encounters. This is speaking about marriage, living together. When Jesus refers to these events, he speaks about they took in marriage, they gave in marriage, about several marriages. This is the intermarriages between those who worship God and those who don't. Pagans in later time, in the biblical accounts, would often be intermingled with those who worship God, and it would always end in disaster. So this is the breaking down of the sons of God, that is the believers, because they intermingle with those who don't. Now, notice that when Seth's generation is mentioned in chapter 5, it takes us back to God, created in the image of God. These are the sons of God in this story, in this account. And it is because of this intermarriage and the immoral life that thereby will be the result, the destruction of the worship of God. It's because of that there is a punishment. God says, my spirit will not content with man forever. He is mortal. His days will be 120 years. By the way, if these beings were heavenly beings, why should that result in a punishment of human beings? No, these are human beings. They are punished. And then you have a general statement about the affairs before the flood. The Nephilim, mighty people, were on the earth in those days. In other words, they are people with great potential. Living longer would be disastrous because their moral, their ethics, is not as it should be. And then the result in verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. And then comes the flood. But that is for our next tidbit. So let's round this off. We're speaking about family. Why do we have this list of generations? We have 5 in this section before we get to the account and the story and narrative about Abraham from verse 12. In the account of Abraham, we have no such generations, but in the following section we have 5 again. We are moving from Eden to Babylon. This is the last big event in this section of Genesis when we come to the story about the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. Then we are moving with Abraham towards the promised land. And then from the end of chapter 22, we are moving with Abraham down to Egypt. And there in the end of Genesis, we share the hope of coming back to the promised land of God, to the home that God will create for his people. In this hope for a home, you have here presented 2 generations. And the generations are important not because they are complete in our modern sense of generations, but because they tell, where do you come from? They ask the question, what is your identity? Are you one of those who would continue the line of worshipping God? Or are you one of those who would live your life according to the rule of power? The empire builder. The Cain who is accomplishing everything he can and saying to God, this is what I have done. Or do you belong to those who with Abel and later with Seth would worship God, bring your offering and say, God, I need you to choose the sacrifice in my place. This is the struggle. These are the 2 lines. These are the election processes in Genesis. And welcome back as we read on in this exciting and rich book of the Bible. Thank you.